What's up, guys? It's Ben with 2020 election predictions, and today I'm going to be looking at this model from JHK Forecasts. I've done a little bit of research on this model, and it looks really good. I've looked at the states, and I just kind of want to briefly take you through this model and let you know what I think about this. And I want to say thank you all so much for subscribing if you already have, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Because if I get 250 subscribers by May 15th, then I'm going to be doing a giveaway to 3 of my subscribers. And in the next video, I'm going to announce what that giveaway will be. So please subscribe right here if you haven't already. So just looking at the service level of this model, right now it has Joe Biden at about a 63% chance and Donald Trump at a 37% chance to win the presidency. And obviously, these are not polling averages. I mean, I think the latest polling averages have Trump and Biden within like 3 or 5 points. But this is just the percent chance that they think each is going to win the presidency. And if you look back at my last video that I did on the prediction markets, they actually favor Trump a lot more because that one doesn't factor in like the polls or anything. That's just like what people think at this point. So they're buying and selling shares basically in Trump to win the presidency and Biden to win the presidency. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But as you can see, Biden and Trump have been pretty close recently. I think this is due more to the coronavirus response. Trump has said some things in the press conferences that have been a little foolish, and he's been lambasted in the media for it. And so I think that I don't know exactly if it's really reflected in the polls or if it's something else, but like the expert ratings. But yeah, as you can see, he's done a little bit worse recently. But as you can see, I think it's going to trend towards it getting closer. And I mean, it's going to go all over the place until November 3rd. So it is a little foolish to kind of try to project it, but it's fun to look at. And I appreciate the people at JHK Forecast for doing this. So just diving into one of the states, North Carolina, this is actually the closest state that they have on here. And what this is an 80% confidence interval. And so 80% of the projected Trump percentage share of the votes are in this confidence interval. And I don't know what it is exactly. It looks like it's between 43 and 55, which is a pretty big one, but it's early, so it's hard to tell. And this is a statistical tie right here because they're both within the bands of each other. So, and as you can see, Trump's had a historical advantage, but what I think is most interesting is looking at how they calculate this. So they look at the fundamentals, which would be like the historic results of the states. They might look at the 2016 results, 2018 results. They're going to look at the registered Republicans versus registered Democrats. They're going to look at maybe Trump's popularity in the state versus Biden's popularity in the state. Polling average is just a pure polling average. They look at these polls, obviously. State similarity, I'm not exactly what this is. I'm assuming it's related to the fundamentals. If in the comments, if y'all have an idea of what this means, I would love to know. And expert ratings, these are just going to be political science and election experts, how they rate this race. And it's pretty interesting. So these weights differ state by state. What I've noticed is they weigh the fundamentals the most, which I think it is pretty wise because if we look at 2016, like FiveThirtyEight, which I think the JHK model is kind of trying to mimic a little bit because FiveThirtyEight was the first one. They mainly only looked at the polls, and even the polls plus forecast wasn't that much different. They heavily rely on the polls. And in 2016, this was right what they had before Election Day. They were really blindsided by Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And I think what this model is trying to they're trying to be a little bit of a better model and not focus on the polls as much, which I think is wise because I think Joe Biden is going to have an advantage in the polls right now. Typically, if we look at incumbents, like even Obama in 2012, they typically don't poll as well 6 months before, but as the election day comes closer, that the polls more accurately reflect um, how they're actually going to do on election day. So the fundamentals and the expert ratings have this tilting towards Trump a little bit, while the polls and state similarity tilt towards Joe Biden. And I think that Trump will probably win the state by 1 or 2 points. But it is interesting that the polls favor Biden. I don't think we should invest too much into the polls right now, just kind of like this model does. But that is pretty interesting. Florida is pretty similar. They have Joe Biden actually favored slightly in Florida, and I think that's just because the polls have him up so much. I mean, the thing why I don't trust the polls as much is because there's some of these there's these outliers. Like, there's no way Joe Biden's going to win Florida by 11 points, and they're including these in the model. I would definitely want to look at how these polls are conducted. Sometimes they oversample registered Democrats, and that can skew the polling data. So I tend to trust the experts and the fundamentals the most. And the fundamentals of the state, they have just 0.1 towards the Democrats, and the expert ratings have this +1 towards Trump. And I think this makes sense, especially considering how well the Republicans did in 2018. Ron DeSantis, who he was in the polls, he was down like 6 or 7 points to Andrew Gillum, and Ron DeSantis ended up winning, even though it was a very narrow margin of victory. And he was a super Trump guy. I mean, he was everything Trump, and I think this bodes well for the president in Florida in 2020, all 29 electoral votes. And moving on to Arizona, I think this will be the closest state in 2020. As you can see, it's a statistical tie like the other ones. And the polls have Biden up. Obviously, they don't invest much in the polls. They only weigh them by 20. And I think you have some of these Ohio predictive insights like +9, +6, Latino decisions +8. I kind of question how these polls are done. I don't think Biden is up by 6, 8, or 9 points. And so I think the expert ratings and the fundamentals tamper the effect that the polls have, which is smart. So 538 might have this poll going even more in Biden's directions because they're not factoring in fundamentals or the expert ratings. And I think the fundamentals do favor the Republicans very narrowly. I mean, obviously in 2008, McCain won the state by a lot, Mitt Romney by a little less than McCain, Donald Trump by a little less than Mitt Romney. So it's definitely trending in the blue direction. Biden will probably outperform Hillary Clinton. But I still think Donald Trump can hold on to the state. But obviously, I don't know. I think the state really could go either way. I think it's going to be the closest state in the 2020 election. Okay, so I don't want to click on every state just because I don't want this video to be too long. But just looking at Wisconsin, this is one of the Rust Belt states. This is the Rust Belt states that is the most favorable to the president in this model, which I think is probably accurate. The polling average, Joe Biden is only polling 2.4 points ahead of Trump, which is actually less than it was in Florida and Arizona, which is interesting. And the expert ratings and fundamentals have this as a pretty close race. I know there's been some polls that even have Trump ahead in the state, but I think that this will be a heavily looked at state. I know the Democratic National Convention is supposed to be in Wisconsin, and I think a lot of money will be poured into the state. Hillary Clinton famously didn't visit Wisconsin in 2020, but you sure as heck bet that Joe Biden will be campaigning in Wisconsin, and so will Trump. And so if Trump takes North Carolina, Florida, Arizona, and Wisconsin, that would be enough to get him 269 or 270 votes, depending on the second districts in Nebraska and Maine. So I think that's his easiest path to victory. Obviously, Michigan and Pennsylvania, and even Minnesota and New Hampshire are not looking as favorable. But I think that it wasn't reflected here in the 538 forecast. Obviously, Trump is in a better position in these states than he was in 2016, so that could bode well for him going forward. And just the last state that I want to look at, just because I thought this was interesting. So Biden is ahead in the polls by 11.4 points. I think this is well, obviously because there's only one poll, so it's not polled well. And I think the people at JHK Forecast smartly realize this, and they only weigh it by like 1 percentage point, which I think is very wise and prudent. And they're more focusing on the fundamentals of the state and the expert ratings. Obviously, Trump only lost the state by 1.5 points. And so they realize that this poll is not seeing the whole picture. And I even think they might be underestimating Trump here in Minnesota. Of course, if Amy Klobuchar is Biden's Democratic vice president choice, then Minnesota will definitely go to Biden, I think. So just looking at this model, obviously, I don't think Nate Silver did as bad. He's the owner of 538. Did as bad as some of the other models. Like New York Times had Hillary Clinton at 95%. Princeton had a model where it was like 99%. And so Nate Silver kind of likes to brag on his model, saying, "Well, look, I did a lot better than the other people," which he did. Obviously, he still got it wrong, but I'll be really interested to see the 538 2020 model. And I think either they're going to change the way that they look at these states, but I think already the polls are showing that Trump is doing better in these states than he did in 2020. And that might be because these polling companies have changed their methodology already. So I'll be very interesting to look at that. And just briefly to look at this article, this guy, Harry Enton, says that Trump has broken the polls and that we should actually invest more into the polls. So the polls right now have Joe Biden having a significant advantage over Trump. But this guy finds it weird. An average of recent polls find that a majority of voters, about 55, believe that Trump will defeat Biden in the election. And this has been pretty consistent over a lot of polls throughout Trump's first term. And what I found was interesting, historically, the question of who thought would win had actually been a pretty good predictor. One study even determined that from these dates, asking people who they believed would win is more accurate than the polls, which is pretty interesting. And obviously in 2016, this wasn't the case because everyone thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. But what this guy says that in 2018, this was completely wrong. So when asked in polls, people thought that Republicans would keep the House by 50 to 44% margins, even though Democrats were the clear favor. And so what the author argues is that this is because like no one trusts the polls anymore, and people think that that the Republicans and Trump voters are just completely underestimated. And so he thinks that people have a false confidence that Trump is going to do a lot better than he actually is, and that until the election actually happens, and this guy argues that Biden's going to win, that people will kind of adjust what their expectations are going to be. And I think this is a pretty interesting argument. I don't buy into it completely, but this guy is kind of saying trust the polls, which is not a very accurate, not a very popular argument right now. So I do respect Harry Enton for making this argument, and we will of course see if he's right after the election because it's hard to know at this point. So thank you all for watching this video, and please subscribe here if you haven't. I'm going to be using this model, the 538 model, Real Core Politics model, a lot because I really like them. So be on the lookout for more of these videos coming in the future. Thanks.